Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 22, and today I'm here with Akilah S. Richards talking about liberation. Akilah is an unschooling podcaster, consultant, and founding board member of the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. Her work explores privilege and power in our relationships with our children and centers the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color raising free people. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. More of you have been clicking those stars in your podcast app or on iTunes and leaving reviews for the show, and I really appreciate it. That simple gesture goes a long way in helping other families like yours find the Sage Family Podcast. Cassie Leah writes, "Finding the Sage Family Podcast has been so validating and utterly inspiring to me as a new mom. I've been going down Rachel's lineup of podcasts almost every weekday during our morning stroller rides and or afternoon naps. I used to nap with him, but I've been happily trading my sleep to listen more. Thank you, Rachel, for sharing such sage advice, insight, and wisdom, for all of your resources you share, for curating the best guests to also learn from and connect with. Everything resonates with me so deeply. It's like a huge breath of fresh air." Cassie Leah, thank you sincerely for posting your review, for listening, and for following along on Instagram. It's a pleasure to keep you company on those morning walks and during afternoon naps. Our big adventure for October was a trip to Northern California. We attended my best friend from high school's wedding in Santa Cruz and then drove up to San Francisco. Our favorite stops were the indoor rainforest at the California Academy of Sciences and Alcatraz. As a weird lover of abandoned historical buildings, Alcatraz has been on my adventure bucket list since childhood. While the touristiness and the crowds were not our style, the experience was incredible. Even West at 6 was fully immersed in the audio tour, completely losing himself in the history of that place. From within solitary confinement, Bay posed thoughtfully, "If I were locked in here in total darkness, I would do lots of exercising." I countered, "Many inmates do, though that only occupies a bit of time, and they were locked in here for 14 days. Modern prisons still use solitary confinement, and they are proven to be psychologically torture, not to mention ineffective. Experiential learning is so powerful. Standing in that cell, Bay couldn't help but try to put himself in their shoes." Walking around the island together, taking in the beautiful surroundings while digesting the tragic stories, so many rich conversations were shared. I'd swim for it. That's what I said aloud while we stood on a ledge above the sparkling violent currents, reading about an inmate who was shot trying to jump off the rock. It led to a quality conversation where I landed on, if I was sentenced to life in Alcatraz and believed there to be even a 5% chance of making it, it wouldn't feel like suicide, but a worthwhile and calculated risk in which I would be choosing life, not death. A thoughtfully planned escape attempt, even with the high odds of drowning cold and free, would have felt less like suicide than doing nothing and dying inside the prison cell block. But everyone had a different and thoughtful take. I saved this adventure for this episode with Akilah because of something we saw there related to this topic that affected us deeply as homeschoolers. So keep an ear out for it. If you want to see photos and videos of this adventure, then head on over to Sage Parenting on Instagram and follow along. Today, Akilah is joining me to share a conversation on liberation. We're talking deschooling and people of color and all the kinds of things that disrupt the status quo. I came across her podcast, Fare of the Free Child, a long time ago, and it's still one of the podcasts that I consume in my regular podcast diet. And her authentic and sometimes vulnerable Instagram stories are a value add to my social media community. I learn a lot from her, and I know you will too, and I'm excited to share a conversation with her and shine a light on this woman. Now tell us your story, Akilah. Who are you? What are you passionate about? What about your relationships and life fulfill you? And what is your relationship with this topic of liberation?
Thank you so much, Rachel, for making time to chat with me. It's good. I definitely listen to Sage Parenting as well, and I see repost all over, and I'm like, yes. So it's good to chat. For me, my work and world is really about freedom. I like the L word even better, liberation. The idea that freedom is something we need to activate, right? Freedom is something that isn't just afforded to everyone, and it's also not something that we afford oftentimes to ourselves for varying reasons. And so my life has very much been, especially my adult life, about recognizing freedom and practicing freedom. And what comes with that then is the other side of that coin, being really clear about what oppression looks and feels like, how different forms of oppression intersect, especially for me in my intersecting identities as a mother, as a woman of color, as a Caribbean woman, all of these different things. And so a lot of what I do is just really like exploring out loud and in community what it means to be free, and all the things, all the responsibilities that come with that conversation.
Oh, and it's such a privilege to get to hear a lot of your journey through these topics, just listening to your podcast and listening to your Instagram stories and reading the things you write. So I really appreciate your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I know there's a lot of resonance because it's the sort of thing that so many of us go through, but we tend to go through them in like our journals or with our partner or, in ways that aren't really useful. So I'm always so grateful to feel that sense of community with other people that are like, too, oh my God, what the hell? What do we do?
Yes. So I want to start this conversation with some historical context. When compulsory schooling laws were passed, the goal was to, quote, shackle the mind with salutary prejudices such as may create a conformity of thought. And there was special force applied to extinguishing minority cultures and maintaining the social hierarchy. I'm hoping you can share some historical context with us around how the compulsory school system was created, in no small part as a tool of oppression. And I know you mentioned that you have a book that you like to send people to for that.
Yes, and it's John Taylor Gatto's book, I believe, and it's The Underground History of American Education, if I didn't botch that title. But I think that's what it's called, The Underground History of American Education. It's really good because it goes into a lot of the things that we might have gotten bits and pieces of, the sort of things that show up as conspiracy theory, which is really completely true about the reality of coercive schooling. The idea of mandatory or forced schooling has always been about as a means of control and suppression and colonization. And school is really the newer thing. We talk a lot about the institution of education and how people learn. And we think of schooling as something that has always been around and something we need to protect fiercely. But really, in the grand scheme of how societies have been living and learning together, school is relatively new. What has always been the way has been a lot more of like a partner-centered adult-child way where people are in communication with each other. Schooling came along as a means of feeding systems to say, okay, if we need people to work in these factories, for example, like in the US, where are their kids going to be during that time, and who's going to train their kids to become good factory workers? Well, that's how schooling became a mandatory thing because of the Industrial Revolution at that time. In a lot of different societies, as you alluded to, Rachel, schooling has been a means of, I think about indigenous cultures, Native American, where schooling was introduced as a means of violently removing people from their culture, separating them from their culture and language and family and customs so that they can make more sense inside of a colonial system. And so when I think about schooling, I think a lot about colonialism, and the nature of how a lot of these systems have perpetuated have been through studenthood. And so it's important for us to recognize when we think about schooling, when we think about education, when we think about childhood, to not pile schooling on top of that, because really schooling is this newer thing that was more about what to do to control people as opposed to what to do to educate people.
Yes. The adventure of the week that I shared in this episode was our trip to San Francisco. And while there, we visited Alcatraz, and there's this plaque outside of the cell houses with this photo of 19 Hopi men who were imprisoned for refusing to send their children to government boarding schools. The white men said, "This is a gift. We will lift your children out of this squalor." And then they put them in a uniform and cut their hair and forbid them from speaking their language, and taught them that the European settlers were their saviors and their tribes were savages. I mean, in elementary school, I was required to make a feather headdress out of construction paper and celebrate Christopher Columbus's arrival. And I'm not that old. Like, this is pretty recent. So I just want to invite you to take a minute to reflect on your personal schooling history and just question the effect of some of the things you were taught, the things you weren't taught, and how they were taught.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Rachel, because the thing is too, when we think about those stories, and we're around in a time right now where there's a lot going on around things like Thanksgiving is coming up as we're recording this, and more people are aware of these, Columbus's birthday, I think recently passed, or Columbus Day or whatever it was. And a lot more of us are aware of that. And we need to look at it in its current context. These are not like ridiculous things, tragic things that happened in the past. They shape and form very much what's happening now. When you think about now how a child of color can be in a school system today in 2018 and hear very little and see very little of their own reflection in what is shared, in what is celebrated, outside of the one-off idea of holidays or certain months of the year like Black History Month. These things are still happening now. The way that we are indoctrinated into a system that says, hey, the closer you are to whatever white supremacy agrees on as okay, then the safer you are. So that means your own language, if that's not the origin of your own language as a non-white person, is something that you're supposed to move away from, a lot like Native Americans. Your way of dressing, that you wear your hair, all of these things are vilified and suppressed. It's a toxic combination of vilification and suppression that says you are not okay. And the closer you are to everything that isn't your culture, then the more successful you become. That's still very much the message ingrained in schooling today.
Yeah, so let's talk about that oppression piece. Your podcast intro says you can't keep using tools of oppression and expect to raise free people. So talk to me about how mainstream schools are oppressing people today.
Yeah, so a lot of the things that I mentioned already in terms of the vilification of non-white culture, the suppression of non-white history, the renaming and the outright lying, aspects of the history and histories and cultures are showing up a lot, and they're pervasive in schooling. And those are the things that then separate us from our families and our cultures, and also from each other. Because the idea is that there's this one thing to move towards, this one standardized idea to move towards. And the more we move towards that, the further we move away from our humanness, the further we move away from the very organic ways that children connect with each other before they learn other ideas of who they need to be, or how they need to show up, or how they are better than someone else because they get better grades, or because they dress better, or because their parents have more time to do certain things with them. These are all different ways that different forms of oppression intersect. So someone might say, well, no, I'm not dealing with any oppression because my kid is in this wonderful private school where they get to play and be themselves. But what are they learning? And when they're inside that little bubble, who is it that they're saying is less than them? Who is it that they're saying is ignored? Whose ideas and feelings and perspectives are ignored? What is promoted? And how do those things tie into the ways that we oppress each other as people? These are the sort of things that are happening inside school system, because the school system is really, it's just a mirror of colonization in terms of when you think about what it does. It standardizes, how it separates, how it puts competition as the primary thing, how we're not working in community because the person right next to you who could be your neighbor in the classroom setting is your competition because only one person is going to get that perfect thing. All of these ways that work in direct opposition to community and self-exploration and emergent structure, these are all the different ways that oppression becomes normalized for us and how we then perpetuate that onto each other as a part of being steeped in it in a system.
Yeah, and the research supports all of these things that you're saying. I mean, boys are called on more than girls in math and science classes. Like, most of us have heard school to prison pipeline, but what the research shows is that Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended and expelled, and students who've been suspended or expelled are 3 times more likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system the following year. And I mean, these are very concrete, systemic things that lead to all this. For example, even something as simple as requiring a doctor's note if a student is late or absent in a society, in a community where healthcare is not a right, it's a privilege. Not everyone can afford to bring their kid to a doctor every time they don't feel well. And there are disciplinary policies in place where if you show up late or you miss a day and you cannot present that doctor's note, then here's the disciplinary action that takes over.
Yeah, yes. And these are very much normal experiences. No matter what city or town my family and I are in, we're a nomadic family, so we get to be in a lot of different spaces. You see the same sort of issues that are showing up with groups of people who are along the margins, marginalized group of people. And essentially, it is very much white supremacy has very much a clear foothold and informs a lot of how schooling is set up. And as a result of that, a lot of how we as society work together, the ways that we live together, the ways that we view each other, a lot of those things are stuck inside these schoolish ideas that are not centering people and community and the realities that people face and the truth about how people are targeted at all.
Yeah. So let's talk about deschooling, because that's part of the way that we can all move away from this. The first chapter of the Sage Homeschooling book is deschooling because that intention is the primer. It's the deep inner work of unpacking the generations of baggage we have inherited. How can we get out from under these paradigms during our deschooling process?
Whew, how much time you got, Rachel? Whew, honey. So I love this question too, because I love that we get to dialogue about the real. I think that's so much of our perspective on parenting in particular is based very much on this presentation model, right? Like you need to be a certain way, the whole, very much like school. It's like, if you don't get school right, something is wrong with you because the thing is set up. You just got to apply yourself. You got to push, you got to meet the right teachers. Your parents need to figure out how to work and be at the school all the damn time. Like, all of these things are about everything but the system. Same thing with us and deschooling.
That bar for what is normal and what is successful is set on like the rich white male standard.
Exactly. And this is the issue with us romanticizing schooling, right? I like to say that when people hear the term unschooling, which I love the term. I don't think it needs to be changed at all. When people hear the term unschooling, we're thinking inside a very specific box. That's the first problem, and I'll come back to that. But also, people think about it as as something that is trashing or bashing schooling. people are working for the liberation of young people and each other, even inside of the school system. The problem is that we romanticize the school system, which then in turn vilifies the people who don't fit into it, right? And that's many, many people. And the reason those people don't fit into it, back to my original point, is not because of those people, but because of this, it's a system that really wasn't focused on people to be with. Sure, many of us learn how to survive in it. Sure, there are even of us who learn how to use bits of it to our advantage. And we get fortunate that we meet beautiful, brilliant teachers who treat us like people along the way. But that isn't the standard story. But we keep treating it like it's the standard story. And so deschooling says, let's question these things. Let's take a pause, right? You know this from your book, like deschooling, it tends to start out in a space that is very much talking about school. Like it has the word school in it. To say in school, it's do all the things all the time, perform, pretend you're doing shit even if you're not. And then deschooling, and deschooling says pause all of that so that you can just be, period. Yeah. So you can be, and then from that state of being, then questions arise because you're quiet enough, long enough for those things to arise. And those questions arise, and then some of the answers are already there. Some of those answers are like, no, I'm really clear that this actually was never okay for me. Or some of them won't even have an answer like, why did I allow that? I don't know why I allowed that. But that process then takes you to a space now where you're thinking about yourself, not within the confines and the context of school. You're transcending studenthood, and now you're looking at personhood. So when you're deschooling, one of the beautiful things about it is that it helps you to make that transition from student to person. And when you start to look at yourself and young people as people, then the deschooling gets really beautiful, Rachel, because that's when you can start to say, wait a minute, not only is this not okay, but what can I start doing differently? Or what can I stop doing? Sometimes it's easier to just stop doing a thing than to figure out what to do differently. What can I stop doing right now because this is not in alignment with my authentic self or my authentic beliefs or the beliefs that I now recognize that I have? You know, how do I battle this dissonance between who I've been or who I've been forcing my children to be versus who I recognize now that I am becoming, or who I'm seeing my children as now that I'm making room for them as humans and not just students, not just a fourth grader or a third grader, but somebody who is 9 years old, who has these needs, who's expressing this thing. That's all deschooling is. It's a power pause that then allows you to do this mad question asking, as I keep calling it, and then coming from that space to say, you know what, there's something I can do about these things that I'm recognizing. What might that look like? That ongoing process is essentially deschooling.
Yes, questioning everything, questioning all those beliefs and assumptions and expectations. Yes. And once we can do that for ourselves and for our children, like see ourselves as people and see our children as people, like you said, then we can also start doing that for other people. Because if I can see myself as having value outside of that schoolish context, then I can then start from a place of wholeness. I can then extend that to other people and to other issues that don't even necessarily affect me personally.
And that's the thing, because, you know, there's this saying that we use back home in Jamaica, everything is everything, you know, like everything is connected. And it's very much, as you said, you start to recognize it in connection to other issues. And the beautiful thing about that is that you also start to recognize that you don't have to, and this is so important to me for us to really start thinking about, we don't have to do it. We don't have to first deschool ourselves before we can deschool our children or deschool with children. We don't need to do that. It is beautifully complicated and messy. Like for my family, for Chris and me and Marley and Sage, it wasn't that I got like these ahas because I meditated for 42 minutes every day for a year and got it or whatever the hell. It was nothing like that. It was actually just like a lot of anger and frustration, and my daughters being like, we don't want this shit, and me being like, but why? You know, or like, okay, what if I did more stuff? Or what if I just used this voice that was like, raw? You know, like I did all of that stuff first before, you know, I was like basically belligerent, and my daughter's like one up my belligerence, if belligerence is a word, for me to be like, And then once we freed them from the prison schools, then we could actually start being together. And it was their liberation in practice that then allowed me and Chris to start questioning the ways that we were complicit and the ways that we could do things differently. So that's really important to share, that you don't first have to be like, yes, I'm free. Now that I'm free, I could free my babies, or I could free. No, It touches everywhere, all corners, all bits, in ways you do and don't realize. So once you start down the path, there's this whole idea of trusting the process, which is a big part of what unschooling is. Once you trusting the process, you start to see things. So the messages and the lessons, they come from everywhere, and they do not have to make you whole or complete or free first before you put it into practice. All of it is the practice.
Yes, lots of stumbling along the way.
Yes.
And for me, it is certainly
Yeah.
a lifelong journey. I still often somebody will say something or show me something, and I'll be like, oh damn, look around that corner, I didn't even know that was there.
Yep, absolutely. Especially now as the come around, I'm like working on a piece around it. I try to do one every year about if you're living this life, if you're doing, I call the umbrella of my work raising free people work. And if you're doing raising free people work, there's a lot of vulnerability in the space. There's a lot of stumbling. I love that word. There's a lot of uncertainty. There are a lot of questions that don't actually have direct answers. They just lead you to better questions. Mm-hmm. And because we're all so schoolish, we don't even recognize that as a good thing. It's just like, but I want the answer. I want the definitive answer, right? So it's like, and especially now, as I was saying, around the holidays, there's this meme I saw that said, if you think you're woke, or if you think, you've arrived or whatever, and you're so conscious, go home for the holidays and spend a few days with your family, right? Because all that shit comes crashing down. You're like, oh, damn, we're on the corner, as you mentioned. So it's like we're constantly deschooling, and it's really important to recognize the value of those small victories, those moments when you say, oh, my daughter said something, and instead of me just like hurling my feelings at her or going into this, monster mode, I was able to recognize in the moment my baggage and just shut up. That's a major deschooling moment, but we don't recognize that because we're so schoolish and we're looking for the next gold star,
Yes. All right, let's talk a little bit about access. So one thing I hear often from people is that homeschooling is a privilege and a luxury. And the subtext that I read from that is that it's for rich white people. Of course, privilege is real, and there are often tall and thorny hedgerows in getting off the beaten path. But how can we push through barriers, both philosophical and practical, to break free?
Yeah, I love that question. It's like never not relevant to this conversation. So as we talked a little bit about colonization already, and like the mindset of the way this colonial society has kind of steeped into all of the ways we see things, that perspective, which I fully understand and even believed that at first, as I was looking at, what it would mean for us to live free as we continue to define liberation for ourselves. The problem with that perspective is that it is also very much rooted in the white gaze, because a lot of what we think of as homeschooling, if to go in the broader umbrella, is really just what we see mostly. And what we see mostly are white women who have, someone who's earning income, maybe the person who's working primarily outside of the home or whatever, that they can be at home and read all the books and do all of the things and spend all of their time with their children. And that one model of it is what we all take on now as, okay, that's homeschooling. And if I can't afford to do that, then I can't do it. When we back out of the idea of what one group of people have shown us and into the different ways that other people, including and especially people of color, have been educating our own or unschooling for years, hundreds of years even, we recognize the different ways that it's being done. That's why my podcast, for example, is such an important part of my work, because it allows me to make room to show the different ways that families have been homeschooling and unschooling for years. So it looks communal. It doesn't just happen in a home with one person who's able to buy all the things and send their kids to all the classes. It looks like co-ops where grandma and grandpa and other generations, elders in our we have family members who work from home who are in shifts. We have people who have space but not time, who get together to operate in group settings in that way. There's so many ways that people are working in community where learning is a byproduct of that. And we need to hear those stories more, because then we get in that dangerous mindset of, oh, this is what it is. And if I'm not doing it this way, which I can't afford to, then I can't do it at all. That's the commoditizing of natural systems. It happens too with things like yoga, for example. We see that very much as like a rich white woman thing when it's something that is so indigenous, that is so applicable to everybody, which is something we can all learn how to do. We got to make sure that we are in community with people who are backing away from what we've been told and sold, so we can remember and see what's already happening.
Yeah, it sounds like it's like deschooling meets creativity. Like, question that archetype that you have inherited, and then get really creative in creating what will work for your child and for your family.
Yes, and being in community, because if you're in community, that's one of the major benefits, that you don't have to invent a whole thing. You don't have to come up with all of the details. You can do that in collaboration with other people. When we first started unschooling, I'd never even heard of the term. I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't do any of that reading and stuff until way later on. But it was so lonely. And I hear that a lot from people who start down this path of raising free people. It can seem so lonely, and it can also seem like, oh, I'm not sure if I'm doing the thing, because at least with school, it's a tried path. People have done it, and the people who made mistakes, I could reach out to those people. This one feels lonely, but you don't have to do it alone, because many other people are doing it. And so sometimes before even creativity is finding community.
Yes. Oh my goodness, yes. Actually, the next class that I'm working on is all about that. I run something I call Hack School, which is like a homeschool adventure club. And I get emails and like DMs and messages from people all the time saying like, I see all these amazing pictures of you like frolicking with 20 other kids and like talking with all these other parents. Like, where did you sign up for that? I'm like, I created it. But everybody can. Like, anybody can do that. Like, no matter how rural you're living or how alone you feel, reach out. In coaching, I help families with that a lot. Like, you just keep putting yourself out there. A lot of times it can start like on social media, like Facebook has a lot of groups. But it can grow even to the in-person world from there.
Exactly. And that's what people say. People say all the time to me, oh, I don't have time to do it, or I work outside of the home. But I know the reason why I can look at that and be like, like shamelessly, is because I know so many people who do it with those things in place. I know single mothers who unschool. I know single fathers who unschool. I know poor people, who do this work. I am one of the poor people who do this work, Chris and I. People who, you look at our income versus the type of life that we there. It's again these ideas that we need to deschool from, because one of the other things that has been colonized is very much the idea of living free. That you first have to amass a certain amount of money or amass a certain amount of degrees or whatever. But as you start to deschool and as you start to put it in practice and be in community, you absolutely find out all these different ways that other people are doing it. And you also find ways to tweak it to work for you. So when people are on Facebook, for example, if you work outside of the home and you're thinking, yeah, but I don't know anybody in my area who does it. When you're on Facebook laughing at memes, spend 5 of those minutes looking up groups. You know what I'm saying? Spend 5 of those minutes looking up groups. Find those people in your community. If you work outside the home from 9 to 3, who's doing something during a block of time where y'all can actually meet up and do something. We have to, that's where the creativity comes in. How creative and how diligent am I about creating community around this thing? Because all the other community, I could just close my eyes and turn around and drop into, because these other communities are trying to sell me something, or they're trying to tell me something. But this one here is going to take a little bit more diligence, but they do exist. They do, especially online.
Yeah. And you can just like break it down if that feels overwhelming into really small steps. Like sometimes with coaching clients, I'll say like, okay, come up with a list of 5 groups that kind of resonate with you and you're going to join. And then from there, it's like, okay, comment on one post in any of those groups each day, Monday through Friday. So make one comment. Okay, now I want you to give me the names of 3 people who you find that you're often commenting on the same posts. Like you just one small step at a time. Okay, now the next week I want you to message one of those people and tell them something you've appreciated about the things, some comment that they've made that was inspiring to you or helpful. Like just, we can break it down into these small chunks that feel more doable. And I love that you brought up like that finish line mindset too, because I hear that a lot. Like if my freedom is waiting for me on the other side of the college graduation stage or a 6-figure income, and it's not, like happiness is not waiting in a bigger house. Freedom is not waiting at the other side of a college degree. Like these are the things that you have to create for yourself now.
Yes, and it can be a really hard sell, particularly when you come from a background where all of those things are exactly what you've been told and shown is how you find happiness and how you get valid, right? How you show the people who work so hard. You know, I talk about my own story and my husband Chris's story for us as immigrants who were brought to this country as children with very clear ideas from our parents about what success meant and what our responsibilities were as first generation of people being brought to the U.S. at a young age, and all of that. All these very specific things in your mind that you have a level of respect for and that you spend so much of your life orienting yourself towards. In your deschooling process, you get to question these things and say, wait a minute, I can still honor the fact that my mother and father worked and did all these really scary things that I don't even think I could survive just for me and my siblings to be here. I can still honor and value all of those things without romanticizing school and education as a means of doing it. I can do all of those things and still define education for myself. I can do all of those things and learn how to be okay with my parents not understanding right now why we're making this choice. Like, this is what the work looks like. This is what the liberation work looks like for us in this stage of the journey, not how the hell to get a full scholarship to wherever the hell. So I can, say my kid went to this school. What kid? How are they feeling about it? Are they happy? Are they going there because they want to go there? Who are they? We're asking different questions, and our liberation work is oriented in another direction without negating the people who came before us and did the things that, we won't have a clear understanding in many instances across generations, but we can still move that marker forward. And we do that through community. We do that through deschooling.
Yes. Okay, so you've mentioned unschooling and self-directed learning, and I want to help to paint a picture of that. What can it look like to live and learn with your children as free people? Talk to me about the solution.
Sure. So I first want to bring up a term that is really important in the space for us who are really trying to normalize this option for people, self-directed education. I use that term a lot out loud. I say SDE for short. The goal for us is to really try to normalize it in the same way you'd hear people talk about Montessori, right, as an alternative to conventional education. We want self-directed education to be one of those normal options. And it looks like a lot of different things because it looks like human relationships, right? I can very clearly tell you what school looks like because it hasn't changed much over the years. And also it's super duper standardized and doesn't factor in people. But in SDE and self-directed education, what it looks like is going to vary very much from family to family. For our family, it also, the type of self-directed education is going to vary. We are unschoolers. And another set of families who are immersed in SDE might be people who are school, or another type of free school, or an agile learning center, or they unschool as a part of a cooperative, right? It looks like a bunch of different things. So I want to be really clear about that. For my family, we are a location independent family of unschoolers. So we don't live in a particular city or state. We don't own like a home or a car, these sort of things. We travel really light, and we live in different spaces. And I have two daughters, Marley and Sage, and they're 14 and 12, and they do what they want. I mean, they explore different things. Right now, Marley is very much into dance, and into debate, an odd combination of things. So a lot of what she studies and focuses on centers that thing: persuasive writing, persuasive speaking. She does a lot of trainings with me. We co-keynoted the Homeschoolers Association of California conference this year. So she finds ways to immerse herself in her interests. I find ways to offer her opportunities to immerse herself in her interests. Sage is very much interested in varying forms of art, digital art, freehand art. So she does commissions. I commission her also to work on some projects. My husband is also an artist, Chris, so he does projects with her. She finds challenges online and does those. She's in community with other people who like to do these things too. She's also into costume design. So their days will be spent in part immersing themselves in those things, or they watch YouTube videos or stupid cat memes, like whatever, whatever it is, because learning is a byproduct of living when you are in communities where people care about who you are now and how you feel and what you're working towards. So, that's how it looks generally.
Yes. And so at the beginning of this podcast, I have like our adventure of the week. And at the end, I do like a day in the life with a speaker. And both of those things are really basically trying to offer a picture of what it can look like or what it does look like for different people. Because like you said, successfully, quote unquote, self-directed learning or unschooling or self-directed education or whatever can look, it's a rainbow of ways that you can express those intentions.
Which is the best news ever.
Yes!
Because it leaves so much room for whoever your child is becoming and all the things they want to explore. For strewing, that's one of my favorite words that we use in unschooling, for strewing all the things, for exploring all the things. Like, that's the best news ever, because then you don't have to force or contort anybody into, to fitting one specific thing. They get to actually bloom.
Yes. Oh, so much yes. And a big piece to this unschooling lifestyle is the relationship. I mean, because when you clear all that other shit away, like the main course of what's left is the relationship. It's the connection piece. So I want to talk about parenting while I have you here too. Mainstream parenting is rooted in power, control, force, coercion, manipulation, and then we hope at the other end to have raised empowered, autonomous, self-aware, empathetic, free-thinking, and confident humans. There is so obviously a disconnect there when we as parents are the oppressors. And I talked about this a little bit in the last podcast episode with Alfie Cohn, but when we're looking at it through like a lens of liberation, I really wanted to have this conversation with you too. So far, we've talked about liberation in the context of education, but we have to include parenting in this conversation. How can we move toward liberation in our parenting, in our actual relationships with our children?
Yeah, and I love that you started with the importance of relationships, because that's really all of this. That's what all of this is. All of the other terms are less important than the term relationship building, right? Because all of it is very much that. So this is why I'm so grateful that right now Marley is very heavily into doing the work and helping to get like clarity around what it means to be in partnership between adults and children, and parents and their children in particular. because so much of parenting is very much all those things that you mentioned. And on top of that, it's very much another gaze. Just like when we talk about race or other forms of oppression in adultism, it's very much the same thing, that so much of our parenting style is geared towards like how other adults view us. Do you have that child under control? Is that child well behaved? Are they doing things that are impressive to adults? So once you start to move that away, that's when you can get to do the liberation work, because it's so easy, right? When we talk about liberation in the broader sense, it's really easy to identify oppression in the political arena, in the social arena, in the educational arena. But at home, you could have the person who is the most liberal, the most woke, the most whatever. But at home, their relationship with their kid is deeply rooted in oppression. Not because they're a bad person, but because that's the space in society where there's the least pressure for us to do better, for us to be held accountable. So when we talk about different relationships, the first thing that we want to think about is what it means to be in partnership as a parent. So if I were viewing, I always tell people to think about their child, because this is so jarring and like, what the hell? To think about your child the same way you would think about your adult partner, your adult romantic partner, in the sense of how you would communicate with them. Now, that doesn't work in every relationship, right? But generally speaking, if I think about something that frustrates me and I think about the way that I would communicate it to Chris, or the way that I would need Chris to communicate it to me, it makes a very clear distinction then between what I need or what I expect versus what I do when it comes to children. Yeah. That very simple disruptor is one that's really useful, because really what we need a few different things. We need disruptions for those moments that we go into the baggage that we carry over from the way we were parented or treated as children. Then we need, outside of the disruption, then we need practice and we need language. So we need to be able to use different words than the ones that we're accustomed to using, to receive the wording that we get differently, and to put something different in practice. And so Marley and I talk a lot publicly about what our practices look like, about using certain words and terminologies, about the power of an apology, about becoming a witness. Like when a child does or says something that you're not okay with, one easy disruptor is, instead of going at them to address it or fix it, is to just do nothing. And it sounds crazy, but almost always it's actually possible to do nothing. And that doing nothing isn't like, okay, I'm not going to parent right now because I deserve some free time. It's actually the opposite. It's a very active thing. Like that willingness to be a witness is actually a very active form of parenting, because it allows you not only to observe what you're seeing there, but it allows you to be with how what you're seeing makes you feel, and to recognize your triggers in a moment so that you can take some time to write that shit out, to feel it out, to talk to your therapist, talk to your mama, your God, whoever, so that you get less practice hurling your feelings at your children. And the less you do that, the more you witness, then the easier it becomes for you to recognize when you're about to do something with an emotion. It's just quite a natural, organic thing that happens. You recognize, oh, I'm making a decision to say, why don't you do that? Is that what I want to do right now? What usually happens when I do this? What might I be able to do instead? None of that can happen unless you have one of those three things: a powerful disruption practice, and then language that you can start to use differently, and then the willingness to put those things into practice.
The relationship between parent and child sets the paradigm for how your children will expect to be treated, will expect to interact with people of authority in the world. I mean, if you say, like, we don't talk back, like, and you teach your kid that they are not allowed to question authority, like, that's then what they carry out into all of their other relationships. Like, so when the football coach touches them in a way that doesn't feel good, like, oh, I don't question authority. Like, you just sit in your feeling of disempowerment, because that's the dynamic. That's how the world works. Right.
And that's the thing that we don't recognize, right? Like, again, going back to the gaze, that is such a big part of parenting. It's other people's gaze, and we parent so much to that reality that we don't recognize that the things that we're doing, the things we're saying, the things we're stopping from happening, all of those things not only affect how these young people perform in adulthood and even in their childhood, but it also is about how they navigate things emotionally. So their mental wellness, their emotional intelligence, all of those things are tied to not just what we say, right? Because that's also another performance tactic that we do. I want my kid to see this Claire Huxtable ass version of me when really I'm like, Cardi B or whatever. Like there's all of these ideas of this performance, but because of schoolishness, we compartmentalize that and say, no, it's A, B, and C, and D. It's these 4 topics. But the more authentic we are, the more we give our children permission and practice and language to navigate those tough times, to recognize, as you said, okay, when this person touched me in this way, not only is this not okay because I'm in a household where bodily autonomy is something that is practiced and prioritized, I also have language to be able to say how that made me feel and why I'm not okay with it. Where else do we get that practice and language but at home? We talk about schools being important because that's where some people get those skills. But imagine if we were doing this in community, that we weren't relying on the school system to do these things because we were practicing these things ourselves, then we'd be raising a whole different type of human, that has these skills down that we are like in our 30s and 40s and 50s before we even recognize we even need to have, much less put into practice.
Oh my gosh, yes. My kids often will be in situations that feel, my inner child is screaming in discomfort and panic, and they just breeze right through them and they navigate them with such confidence and such ease. And I'm like, damn, I have so much to learn from you.
Exactly. This is so frustrated when people of our generation, I'm in my 40s, I don't know how old you are, Rachel, but people in our generation, I'll say this blend, how we try so hard, we front so hard. Like if children would just listen, if they would just, we're trying to school them, we're trying to teach them, we're trying to raise the next generation to be whatever. How did things get the way that they are now? Us and the people before us. So then we want the next generations to look at us to fix the same shit that they came into as a result of us? No, we need to have our listening ears on. We need to be better witnesses. We need to understand, which is what's so powerful about unschooling for me, to trust an emergent process, to trust that I do not need to be the conductor or the savior or the leader in order for something to be successful or effective or feel good for all of us. These are the things we get to practice.
Yes, they, quote unquote, society, they want us to they want us to do the same things and they want us to raise different people. Like they want they want the outcome to be different, but they want us to do the exact same things. And it doesn't work that way. If we want to have empathetic, free thinking, confident, self-aware, autonomous humans at the other end of childhood when they are launching into adulthood, then they have to be that way now. How can we, in every interaction, every conversation, every challenge, every happy moment, whatever, I run everything through this filter of what can I say or do or not say or not do in this moment to help foster these qualities that I think will serve them and help to make the world a better place.
Exactly. And that better place world, by the way, like it starts now. I talk a lot about parenting ahead. So much of our parenting, it's a couple of things. It's that gaze of other adults, but it's also the adult version of our kid that we keep looking way past whoever they are right now and whoever they're going to be for the next however many years before they get to adulthood. We look right past that person. And again, drawing on that example of me and my partner, if Chris was constantly just like, man, you're a good person and everything, but man, 10 years from now, when you get this right, and when you get, I would be, I'd be a different person. My head would be off of my body in anger, right? But we take this as not only okay, but like the responsible thing to do. Yeah, sure, pat them on the head, because that's what Chris and I were doing with the girls, with Marley and Sage with schooling. Okay, you don't like it. Right. But we weren't thinking about who they were now because we were thinking so much about like who they could be. And in
Yes.
any relationship, that's a problem.
Yes, because they are whole human beings now, deserving of respect and with valid needs and feelings. I mean, even something as simple as that, like there's this pervasive, part of that childism or adultism, there's this pervasive attitude that an adult's needs are valid and a child's needs are invalid. I mean, even something
Right.
that's simple, like that a little bit of like deschooling or unpacking the baggage on questioning that tiny assumption, those
Yeah.
changes can just reverberate and get so big.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly what starts to happen in this work. And that's why it is liberation work, because the more you recognize, again, these tools of oppression and how you've been putting them in practice, the more you have an opportunity then to put that tool down or to chisel that shit into something totally different that's useful. These are the things that we get to do because we think so much about the fears that we have. And those fears then validate the things that we perpetuate that were never useful to begin with. Those same things that were rooted in fear, we now use. I think about for myself, for example, when we talk about Black culture, there's certain ways we talk about hitting our kids. And not that it's only Black folks who hit our kids, but when we talk about in the US, there's very much, it comes from this perspective of, and also in the Caribbean, this idea of safety. If I don't do it, right, then the person who has more power, the police officer, the white man, the white woman, the whoever, the person in power is going to do it in a way that you might not ever recover from. So I'm going to do it here. So when we deal with those things inside of this context, we don't look at it from a place of like, okay, the people who came before us are horrible people, so let me get this good education and separate from them because they didn't get it. No, we look at where those things are rooted. That's what deschooling allows you the space to do. What is that rooted in? Oh, okay, I can honor where that came from, but I can't honor the practice. Now, what can I do differently when I'm talking to my kid and they speak to me in this way? And I have a very specific idea of what respect means because of how I was raised and because of the fears around, the people who raised me. Now I get a chance to look at that and say, okay, her telling me that something made her upset isn't her being disrespectful, even though that's what my mother thought or my grandmother thought. But their fears around that is different. They knew that if I said that to the wrong person, that might cost me my life. In this instance now, can I have a different conversation with my kid and with myself so that I'm not just perpetuating this thing? This is what we're talking about when we talk about witnessing. This is what we're talking about when we talk about liberation work. So now I've freed myself from this generational trauma of hitting because I've now done different work around what it means to be respected and to show respect.
Yes, that's beautiful. And there's this phenomenon that often happens when we tell our extended family or our friends or our community that we're going to make a different choice, or they see that we are making a different choice. They often experience it as a rejection. So we might be saying, we are choosing to unschool our child because we believe it's in their best interest, and they are often hearing, you think the way we did it is wrong, or you
Yep.
reject the way that we parented you.
Yeah.
And I'm not even necessarily bringing this up to say, like, so Akilah and I have the perfect solution. This is exactly what you need to say. And it will,
Here are the 3 steps. Right.
Exactly.
All that shit. Yeah.
just an awareness that like that happens in the individual relationships, but that also happens on a bigger scale, that when we choose a different path, the people who came before us often will experience that as a rejection. And sometimes even our struggle in getting to making that different choice is getting over that hurdle of not
yes.
wanting to like feel like we're rejecting the people who came before us.
So many times. Absolutely. And then you have the other layer, Rachel, of how that's tied into support. Because sometimes in many communities, that support from the other people, from your parents, as an adult, you might have still your parents are a part of your support system for your children or whoever they are. Their support can be taken as a result of you choosing to do these things. So it's not just their opinion, but it's like the logistics of how you live and how you practice liberation in part through those things. So we really need to be mindful of all these different ways, the different challenges around the work. For some of us, it can be easy as like, you know what, you got to do that personal work, to not care so much about what other people think, because at the end of the day, blah, 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 that's one set of solutions that will work for one set of people. For someone else, if there's financial support or you live with that extended family member, you can't, it does matter. It doesn't matter that are not caring about their feelings. So then what does that practice look like? These are the sort of things that we talk about a lot in the communities that I am part of, and then also have the privilege of being invited into through my podcast. What does that look like now? That's also a part of the liberation work, because it isn't just about freeing children. It is primarily about freeing them because they are not free because of us.
Right.
So that is the primary thing. But what is equally beautiful, maybe it's less beautiful, I don't know, maybe it's less important, but it's really beautiful, is that you also get a lot of language and practice and opportunity to free yourself and to free other people. I find oftentimes when I talk to elders about this, people tend to assume that I get the same thing we just talked about. Oh, you're rejecting me. You turned out just fine. Every once in a while I get that, but Rachel, mostly what I get is, damn, I wish I knew about this when I was raising kids or when I was younger, because people's trauma, their school wounds and their personal trauma, it transcends so much of this other schoolish foolishness.
Yes. So much of the resistance comes from a place of other people, their inner child sort of saying, that's not fair. Like because I know that I feel that sometimes, like when I watch my kids, like pursuing their passions and, living their best lives. Sometimes my inner child has a little mini tantrum, and it's also healing at the same time, like where my inner child will throw a little tantrum and say, that's not fair. I had to sit in a classroom and I wasn't allowed to pursue my interests and all these things. And I'm like, at the same time, it feels incredibly healing. And I think with, I have to share with my husband, when we first started stepping off of the mainstream path, he had one of his family members tell him that he was rejecting his blackness in choosing this other way of living and of being in connection with his kids. And I probably won't even include that in the podcast, but I just wanted to say it to someone
I've heard that one too, Rachel.
Yeah.
We've heard that too. And again, this, I empathize with it because I understand the premise. I keep using the example of like the bus, right? The whole idea that for Black people in America, that whole, the whole struggle around being able to sit wherever the hell you want on the bus. So now that we have that right, should everybody only sit at the front of the bus? No. The point wasn't for us to sit in one freaking spot. The point was for us to choose wherever the hell we want to sit. And that's what this is. But for other people, it's like, no, you sit in the front of the bus, you get as many degrees as you can, and then you go back and you uplift your community by being an asset to your whatever the hell. No, that is also another form of oppression, because it standardizes and puts this sameness around this whole group of people.
Wow, that is an incredible analogy, and I've never even thought about it like that. So thank you.
Yeah.
Right, now I'm going to get you to help me a cue here. So I posted in my Sage Parenting Tribe on Facebook that we were going to chat about liberation today, and asked if anyone had any questions about it. Yana asks, how as a white family can we support and ally the liberation of unschooling families of color, especially from afar, as I live rurally in a town without many people of color?
Great question. So I have a few pieces that I've written about that specifically, and I can send you those links too.
Yes, please.
When I really sat with it and thought through it. In addition, I'll definitely do that. And so in addition, a few things. One is looking for places where there are already families of color and communities of color collaborating for different things, and being in the mix, like asking to be part of the mix, talking about the fact that you have, say, a home group, but you want it to reflect the real world and not just like the area that you live in. A lot of communities, and I've talked to white women who ask me this question all the time, and they do these things and they come back and like, oh, look, they were really receptive, and now we're mixing up this and we're doing potlucks every few months together. So that's the first thing. Where are people of color near you already in community around learning and inspiration? Reach out to those folks and ask to sit for a coffee with someone or come to a thing, or if you have a space, for example, maybe that group of people can use for a thing. Offer to organize a potluck. Everybody bring some food. Y'all can be a part of this space. Also, getting leadership from people of color in the groups that you are in. Like, not just talking about it or reading the books of the dead people, but now, like, who's alive and doing the work now? Are there ways that you can invest in that work by buying these things or sharing these things? These are some of the ways that you can start to connect so that specific communities and people of color can tell you how you can support them.
Okay, let's move into a day in the life. So describe your favorite day this week and share with us why you loved it.
Easy, super easy. Yesterday, did a lot of sleeping and hanging out. And Marley and Sage and Chris, at one point, we were all in the room together, watching like some sort of memes. I can't remember what the memes were around, but we got on like a whole theme of a certain type of memes, and we spent hours on the bed just like giggling around that in between the naps that I needed to take yesterday. So that was pretty awesome.
I love when people share like down days too, because we often talk a lot about, especially as unschoolers, we sometimes feel this pressure to be like, look at all of these ways that my children are quote unquote excelling. And so I love to have sometimes
we're learning.
Yeah. Right. I love when sometimes people come on and they're like, we were in bed all day and we were laughing at memes. Like, those kinds of stories are like, yes, like that is a big part of why we live this lifestyle, so that it can look a myriad of different ways, including days where you go inward and connect.
Yes, and those are the days that so many great conversations can arise too. When you're just hanging out together as humans, nobody's quizzing anybody, nobody's asking anybody what they need, then it also leaves a lot of room for the types of conversations that you don't get to have otherwise, because everybody's in performance mode.
Oh my gosh, yes. So let's take our deep dive. The show notes can be found at sageparenting.com/podcast22, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So what are your favorite resources, Akilah, for people to dive deeper into this topic? And of course, I'm going to have a link to your website, and which is akilahsrichards.com, right?
Yes. Also raisingfreepeople.com.
And Raising Free People. And to your podcast, which I adore. So what else?
Thank you. Yeah, so the Alliance for Self-Directed Education is, I think, the go-to spot. I love very much that site. I'm very much so grateful to be a part of that organization. I'm on the board for the Alliance and the self-directed.org. Beautiful space for you to read details, for you to watch videos, and maybe most importantly, for you to join the forums. The forums is a space where you can, or the forums are, because there's several different forums in the space, spaces where you can have conversations with people locally. You can find out about things that are happening. You can get something started, as we were talking about earlier, Rachel, about being creative, getting what you want or starting what you want. There's local SDE groups that are supporting for people to get together in their city and talk about and evangelize and create around self-directed education. All of those things are happening through the Alliance, and so that is a great space for you to learn about what's going on in your city, what's going on in other countries, and where you can get support for what you want to do. You also mentioned my site, Akilah S. Richards, which is also raisingfreepeople.com. They go to the same space. I have workshops that some of them I offer on occasion, like the Raising Free People workshop, and then others are virtual and all the time, like parenting patois, and how to focus on learning, that are really just about like, what do the specifics of this work look like under these particular circumstances? If I'm a facilitator at a self-directed space, as a parent, what do these things look like? What can I be saying or doing differently? Those are some of the spaces where you can explore that work in great detail and in community.
I am not on the self-directed education website's forum, so I need to follow that link. And
yes,
that sounds
please
like the happening
become
place
a member.
To be.
It really is, and it's free to become a member. Of course, we need donations, but it's free for you to become a member free for you to get in these forums, and it's such a great space for you to recognize that you're not alone in it, and that whatever your questions are, wherever you are in the process, is okay. As long as you're in that process, it's okay. It's totally okay. And that's one of the things I get from people so much, like, is this okay? I just don't know. Yes, it's okay. And if you go to the Alliance's website, you'll see many articles, videos, and all of these things that remind you that it's okay and what you can do to keep doing this work.
Akilah, thank you so much for sharing a conversation with me. I not only thoroughly enjoyed this, but I know that this is going to shine a light on something that a lot of people have asked me about, and that I think it's really important for people to hear a conversation about. So I cannot thank you enough.
You're so welcome, and I really appreciate you asking me to be on and chat and spread the word. Thank you, and thank y'all for listening.